talked a lot about how over the years, every, 3 or 4 years, if you were to take like a core sample, like they do in Antarctica with like, the ash and whatever else is in the air, you can see like, what we're doing. And I got to think if there were top 5 things we do, 4 of them change every 5 years, right? Does that seem
Yeah,
reasonable? I don't
that's
know.
totally fair.
So, so maybe the purpose of this conversation is talking about where we are right now and what looks like a imminent, if not already happened, move to NestJS, and maybe talk about kind of generally speaking where we are right now and what about Nest do we like, and maybe compared to other stuff like I don't know Express or other things.
Yeah, for sure. So I think right now, in terms of our total stack, we've been on React, and we're still loving that. That's on the front end side, and when we vary that, we'll use Gatsby, which is a framework on React for static site generation. We'll use Razzle with After.js if we're doing server-side rendering, which is still front end, but there's back end components of it. And so that's been pretty consistent over the last few years. Obviously, adding those new frameworks in like Gatsby and Razzle has been relatively recent. But on the backend side, we've mostly been, as long as we've been in Node, we've just been on Express as the HTTP web framework. And that's kind of the go-to for a lot of people. There are other frameworks out there like Happy, and there's Fast.js, which is relatively new. Or Fastly, it might be called. But there's plenty of other frameworks out there, but we've been mainly on Express just because that's what seemingly everyone uses.
Yeah.
And so on top of that, we've used GraphQL on the back end for a long time now. And so with that, we use Apollo Server with the Express integration. So that's not necessarily a full framework on the back end, but it's a way to implement the GraphQL protocol on
Sure.
the back end in Node. And so that we've kind of built up our own structure and standards around how we structure those types of projects on the back end. And we have some plugins that we reuse across projects in terms of the Apollo server, but a lot of it has still kind of been just built up on our standards because Express as a framework is very, very basic. It doesn't actually define very much in terms of how you should structure things. In terms of the file structure, or even how you should create different routers and things like that to separate concerns.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an open field. And so one of the things we've been looking into as we continue to kind of expand on our tech stack on the back end side, especially in Node, is a more structured framework. And so that comes in NestJS, which is different from Next.js or Next.js. There's plenty of other things named similar to it, but this is the NestJS, N-E-S-T, on the backend side. And this is a framework that is allows you to run it on Express. So it's still using Express, but it's a fully fledged framework that's built on top of it. And it's TypeScript first, so and it's modern tooling and everything around that. So a few things that we love about it so far, and some of the main reasons for us going to it are that it has a lot of tooling built into it. So it has a command line tool built in that allows you to generate scaffolding. It integrates with TypeORM, which is the ORM that we've been using for database connections. And it has a lot of documentation, I think, is the main thing. Because it's more opinionated, it then is able to have very specific documentation around how you should implement certain architecture patterns and things like that. So far, it's been pretty interesting, and I think the main problem we're trying to solve is a way to ramp up new devs quicker. And the beauty of having an opinionated framework is that it has the documentation already built in that allows you to look up, how should I implement X or Y?
Right. There's a way you're supposed to do something. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's certainly patterns and structures that we take it further on and add our own opinions onto. But a lot of the base structure that is there already and defined through their documentation, which is helpful.
That's great. And remind me, are there things that we looked at as competitors? Maybe it was Next or Nest or not Nest, but Next. Right? It's just like a tongue twister. Like what else do we look at? What do we say no to and why?
So the main thing is a lot of people use just Express, but there's also frameworks like Happy, which is a pretty modular API focused, API centric backend. So Happy.js, we actually have a project that uses that. And with that, it's a little more outdated. It doesn't have TypeScript kind of like out of the box as well, and it doesn't utilize annotations, which is NestJS is built with a lot of annotations because of it uses TypeScript. Whereas Happy is still, you can run it just plain JavaScript, and so it doesn't have a lot of the advanced features that you can get with TypeScript. Other things out there, we've looked into Keystone, which is more of a CMS, but it's also a headless API that is pretty similar to Happy in terms of just like being API focused. So look there, and then a lot of the other kind of backend frameworks in Node are similar to Express, where they're less opinionated, they're very open-ended. So Nest is really the first one that we found that has kind of the structure that we were looking for.
Okay. And how does it, I know we were using admin.js for a lot of our kind of backend controller kind of functions for business users. How does it play in that universe?
Yeah, great question. So we still use admin.js, and we just run it as a separate project alongside. And then we just have a shared library that is shared between the Nest application and admin.js so that we can define our database models and everything else that should be shared between the two.
How about for new people? So what's something you say to either our own new developers or people who might just be looking at Nest for the first time? What did you, if you could have a time machine and go back to when you were first learning it, like what about it was surprising or unusual that you'd pass along to people?
Yeah, good question. I think the modular structure is, if you know Angular, you'll be familiar with it, because I think a lot of Nest, the structure-wise, is taken from Angular in terms of the module pattern that they follow. But I think if you aren't familiar, definitely I point them to read through the documentation on modules, specifically in the Nest documentation. They gives you conceptually what it is and how these modules work in terms of how they share different services with the imports, exports, and providers and everything like that. And I think getting into the mindset of coding, especially on the back end, modularly, because I think on the front end side of things, with React, Vue, and Angular, everyone has been thinking very modular in terms of how they code things.
Yeah.
You have modular components that then you have everything kind of defined separately, including the styles for those components and everything. Yeah. On the backend side of things with Express, there hasn't really been that modular system, and a lot of people are implementing their own structures in terms of where do I put all of the business logic, where do I put the database models, things like that. So with Nest, definitely point them towards that direction of reading through the modules, the services, and how everything is structured. I think also pointing them just at the command line tool, because there is a way to generate full CRUD even from just a single command, which gets you bootstrapped pretty quickly. And also they follow the modular structure. So I think it's helpful to see how just how this code is structured, where you put a service, where you put a controller, and things like that, which is great.
Yeah. How about maybe the final state of the stack comment? What are the other things that we're kind of getting into that would be cool to hear about, like Kafka, event-based stuff, like what are the things that through the end of the year we will be experimenting with?
So definitely getting more into event-driven architecture with microservices. I think they go or they play nicely together, and that is one of the reasons that we decided to look into Nest in the first place. So Nest, they support GraphQL out of the box, and then they also support microservices out of the box through their system. Yeah. And with that, we can build event-driven architecture systems in a way that is still built within that platform of NestJS. And so we were able to generate a new microservice with just a command, which is great, and then connect that to the other microservices. And the reason that we've decided to go with it for the project that we're using Kafka for, which is an event streaming and message queue, is that NestJS has an adapter for Kafka. and it allows you to configure all the event producers and consumers in a way that is agnostic to the technology you're using. So if we wanted to, let's say, move away from Kafka and instead switch to EventBridge and AWS or something like that, we could then just swap out the adapter code as opposed to having to rewrite all the different places.
Oh, that's cool.
So that is a big advantage. But yeah, so with the event-driven architecture, trying to move more towards that, just to speed things up on the back end, especially in more complex systems with our microservices. The whole idea there is that our microservices are relatively ignorant in terms of the other services that need to happen, as well as the kind of flow of code through the system. So in many cases, we want to be able to just publish an event that occurred from one microservice and allow the other services that maybe care about that event to do something with it.
Right.
That allows that one microservice to not need to know that it needs to talk to the communication service in order to send an email for this thing, and it needs to talk to the billing service to create an invoice for this. All it knows is, hey, there's an order that has been placed, sends a message, and then that service then doesn't care what happens next, essentially, which is great. And so building out more event-driven systems, I think, allow us to build more maintainable code long-term.
Sure.
And also those systems, it allows our teams to work in parallel much more effectively rather than having to know the specific API endpoints that need to be called for this service in order to create an invoice, for example. Instead, our team can just say, all right, we built this microservice that handles this order and it publishes this message. Then there you go. That's all they have to document, and then the other teams can work off of that. So it's great to build a less coupled system.
That's really cool. All right, and that does it for State of the Stack, August 2022.
Excellent.